Hello, hello, hello. Come on now. We got all the great music here. Welcome to Big Tech on Blast. That's right. I am your host, Steven Renderos, with Media Justice, Big Tech on Blast. Today we're doing a watch party to watch one of the most interesting, I'm sure compelling congressional hearings that there has ever been. Today we're going to be hearing from three of the top tech CEOs in the country: Mark Zuckerberg with Facebook, Sundar Pichai with Google, and Jack Dorsey with Twitter. It'll be interesting to hear them, but they're going to be speaking at a congressional hearing today called Disinformation Nation: Social Media's Role in Promoting Extremism and Misinformation. I am actually really lucky to get to do this live stream here with you all alongside a couple really good friends, and I want to really quickly introduce them. Brandi Collins-Dexter, who was the former senior campaigns director at Color of Change, but also now is a writer, a scholar, just an all-around thinker in the space of tech and race. A content creator, if you didn't know this about Brandi. Brandi's a lot of things, and soon to be a New York Times best-selling author. Brandi Collins-Dexter, is so wonderful to have you on here with us for this live stream. How you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me on.
And of course, joining us as well as my third co-host, Carmen Seurato, the Senior Policy Counsel at Free Press. Now, one of the biggest claims to fame, I think, for Carmen is not only is she a collector of tech stationery, which we can talk about a little bit later, because I'm a collector of stationery the tech companies give out as well, but has done an incredible amount of work at Free Press at this intersection of disinformation and Spanish language disinformation in particular in platforms, and is part of an effort through Free Press and other groups like the National Hispanic Media Coalition on a campaign called Ya Basta Facebook. And Carmen, we'll find out what that means a little bit later, but how you doing? Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, I'm great. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. So, let's talk about what we're here to, talk about, which is this congressional hearing that 3 of the tech CEOs are going to be joining. Most people, I would imagine, have no idea what the heck a congressional hearing is. We're among a handful, select few people that actually watch this stuff on C-SPAN or YouTube, I think, for fun. Maybe not for fun, but both of y'all have actually been a part of congressional hearings in the past. So I'm curious, from your expert perspective, how do you go into preparing for a congressional hearing? What is it? What do you think? What goes into preparing for a congressional hearing, and also what is it? Because I don't think most folks know what that is. And Brandi, why don't you kick it off, and then we'll pass it to Carmen.
Ooh, yeah, I was afraid you were going to start with me for the definition. So, a congressional. I'm gonna do my best, and then Carmen, you can back me up. So a congressional hearing is when Congress or certain subcommittees within Congress are thinking about passing some legislation or addressing some legislation on the books to challenge a pertinent issue or something that's happening in the country. Like, how is Congress going to show up when things are going wrong in the country? And these hearings are an opportunity. They can work a couple ways. So one, it can be to bring in experts around those issues, quote unquote experts, to some idea, like, first of all, what role Congress can play, what are some of the challenges around the issue. So in my case, one of the times that I gave testimony was around disinformation last year, and offering my experience being at Color of Change of working with tech companies and how disinformation was impacting Black communities and marginalized communities, I should say. And so that might be one type of congressional hearing. And then members of Congress ask you questions. Each side of the committee, so like the Democrats and the Republicans, each bring up their people. So, the questions are kind of anchored in that way. And then another type is when you're bringing in, which is what we're going to see today, the parties or the CEOs or the people that may be responsible for some of the issues that we're seeing online. So today we're going to hear from the CEOs of Google, Twitter, and Facebook, and they're going to be pressed on this issue of misinformation, disinformation. This is going to be the first time that these CEOs have come together since the January 6th insurrection at Capitol Hill. So, and since the election, I think, as well, in November. So there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff that comes out of that. And Carmen, you can tell me all the places that I got wrong on that.
No, I think that's a pretty great description. I mean, it really is like a fact-finding mission, right? And that's what you'll see. Some of the questions, especially for these tech CEOs, are going to be geared towards like what actually happened on your platform in these, in 2020. That's what we're going to see here. And it's interesting because when I actually testified alongside some CEOs of Sprint and T-Mobile. So it was like a mixed panel in that sense, because I was there, really representing communities of color and really trying to show, members of Congress that if they allowed this merger to go through, that prices would go up, and actually it would disproportionately impact people of color and low-income communities. So, these panels can be very different, but ultimately they are a fact-finding mission for all the reasons that Brandi said about should there be legislation around these issues and what would that look like?
Man, I feel so lucky to be here alongside some wonderful experts. Super excited for not just co-hosting with you all, but we actually have like a slate of incredible guests, an incredible lineup. I mean, it's right up there with, any of the great music festivals that you can think of, Outside Lands, Afropunk. We got the lineup today. Some wonderful experts here who are going to talk to us about misinformation, disinformation, hateful activities online. For all of you all joining us currently, if you just tuned in, you're here with us for the Big Tech on Blast live stream, where we're going to be watching these tech CEOs talk to Congress about their role in spreading disinformation, misinformation. One thing that we've done to actually make it interactive for folks that are watching along is we've actually got a bingo game that we're going to be playing throughout the hearing. So if you don't have the bingo, if you didn't sign up ahead of time and you didn't receive this, you can go to the Media Justice Twitter and you'll find this bingo card. These are just some things that may come up based on experience, based on patterns of how these tech CEOs communicate and testify. So you should totally feel free to follow along with us. I can't promise that there will be a prize at the end of the game, but maybe there will be. We've got some available books and stuff we can give away. So anyways, one quick question, I think, for you all before we bring on our first guests is, we've had a chance to, at this point, we know what these folks are going to be testifying about. So is there anything that you all are, you all have already noted about what their testimony is that, you're curious to see what they're going to say, or, or just what you've seen in their testimony that stands out to you so far?
Would you like
I
to
can go
start?
first.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I read Mark Zuckerberg's testimony, and there's a lot of impressive numbers in there, right? At least that's what they're aimed to do. Like, we took down, Facebook took down 12 million pieces of content of COVID misinformation. We took down 12 other million pieces of content of hate speech from these groups. So you'll see a lot of those numbers during the hearing today. But I think, we have to unpack those numbers, because I feel like they do obscure the reality of what's happening on the platform. And what you're not going to hear him say is, well, we took down these 12 million pieces of content only after this many people viewed it, and only after our recommendations algorithms showed people this content, right? So he's not going to talk about the role that Facebook has played in spreading all this disinformation. So I think that's something that, to look out for. And the other thing that I noticed in Dorsey's testimony is that it actually doesn't have any numbers. It's kind of the opposite. It just says, we care about transparency. We care about algorithmic choice. Like, these are things that we're thinking about here at Twitter. But it's, it really lacks those numbers. So I think it's, really interesting when you compare the two. And I think it's going to show a lot about how they're going to react today to a lot of these questions.
Yeah. And I would say for me, so normally with the policy making, how it's been in Silicon Valley is that the tech companies have tended to stick together. So nobody wants to take that first leap and actually dealing with disinformation in a, radical way. But I think in terms of how the conversation has moved in the last 4 years, and particularly in the run up to the 2020 election and January 6th, we've seen these CEOs kind of go at odds with each other on how to deal with some of the issues that are going to come up. A lot of this is going to hinge around this issue of Section 230. And for folks that don't know, this is, sort of a tiny piece of legislation, the last thing left from the Communications Decency Act that was passed in 1996. It lost in the courts after dealing with a lot of lawsuits from groups like ACLU, and all that was left from that act when it got passed was Section 230, which is what a lot of this conversation tends to hinge on around content moderation, at least in Congress. So it's Section 230 on one hand says that companies are not culpable for what, or legally responsible for what individuals or third parties post on their platform, but on the flip end of that, they're able to moderate their platforms as they see fit. And so what we saw in the testimony that was released recently, and what we've seen from the CEOs, is that they're in 3 different places, at least narratively, around how to deal with 230. Zuckerberg has been, I guess, the most quote unquote open to dealing with regulation and trying to do some work around 230. Jack Dorsey's kind of like been in and out, and Pichai, the CEO of Google, has been like extremely anti-dealing with 230. So I think we'll see in some of the questions that playing out in how they're going to put forward what they think their responsibility is, around their platforms, and whether or not 230 does need to be overhauled or blown up.
Yeah, and I think we're going to dive deeper into, because I think this picks up on a question we saw in the chat about that intersection of free speech and disinformation. We'll unpack that a little bit further. And I think let's grow the watch party here. Let's grow the party in this room. We're going to invite in a couple folks, a couple of our friends to join us for a conversation here. First guest coming in, thank you for joining us, is Heidi Beirich, the co-founder and chief strategy officer at Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. Heidi is an all-around expert on right-wing extremism. Bless your heart for doing that hard work for us. How you doing, Heidi?
Oh my God, I'm fantastic, especially because I'm with you all. This is the best group. Thank you. I haven't seen Brandi in a long
For
time.
sure.
Especially happy for that.
This is what we do at Media Justice. We make reunions happen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next person we've got joining us here on the watch party, let's grow it a little bit more. Jacquelyn Mason, the senior investigative researcher over at First Draft, who, when you're not sending me emails about all the sleuthing that you've been doing in the disinformation space, you also do an incredible amount of research for an incredible organization, First Draft, that trains a lot of journalists in how to cover disinformation, misinformation a little bit better than they did back in 2016. But welcome to the watch party. Welcome you both to the Big Tech on Blast watch party. How you doing?
Thanks, Stephen. I'm doing great. I'm loving these sound effects. It's so nice to see the rest of you. Hi, Brandi. Hi, Carmen. Hi, Heidi. Ready for this.
That's right. Well, can we pick up on this question we got in the chat about talking about this, intersection of free speech and disinformation? I'm curious, Heidi, if we could toss it to you. You all recently came out with a report titled Democracies Under Threat. And I think this place of the conversation of free speech and disinformation has come up a lot in the context of world leaders being kind of some of the main perpetuators of disinformation, but also hateful content. Can you talk to us a little bit about this report?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the debate over free speech has always been very, very simplistic in the U.S. context in particular. This idea that bad speech is going to crowd out good speech and that somehow we all have access to the same ability to put our speech forward is just ridiculous given the terrible racial and other inequities in our society. The report that we just did is very specific. Back in 2015, Facebook gave Trump a pass for its community standards intentionally. This is when he announced the Muslim ban. And they created this huge loophole that all these terrible leaders around the world, people like Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Duterte in the Philippines, have just driven a truck through. And what we know is that these are the exact people who are most likely to be able to incite large audiences to violence, right? And these platforms have been a handmaiden for horrible things like in Facebook's case, the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar. In Duterte, this guy's like a serial human rights violator, and Facebook helped him create his audience engagement system. The Modi government's been implicated in all kinds of anti-Muslim violence. So the point of the report is to say, this is maybe the most dangerous loophole you could create for these extremist far-right leaders who basically spend their time attacking various marginalized communities. And it leads to violence, and those kinds of loopholes shouldn't be there for exactly the people that can cause the greatest problems.
So Heidi, thank you for that. And the report is great. I mean, I think you do a great job of laying out what the problem is. And, there's something here that's actually kind of near and dear to to my heart because I've been working on this issue as well, which one of your key findings, and I'm just going to read it here, says, social media companies lack cultural and language competencies to globally enforce their rules so that societies and democracies are not harmed. What do we do about that?
Well, it is a disaster, Carmen, and you've been doing such good work on content, online content in Spanish, which is a mess. And what I think about is that if you can't actually apply your community standards to Spanish, which is a relatively widely spoken language, what is it going to look like when we're talking about, say, Serbo-Croatian, right? Or various other languages that are spoken maybe by smaller communities. I mean, as bad as the content moderation systems are in English, once we get out of sort of the English sphere, I don't even know what's going on. The truth is we don't even have any research in a lot of parts of the world. And then it comes to cultural competencies. We've got content moderators largely in the US, mostly English speaking, don't know much about a lot of the places that they're working in. I mean, I can only imagine that if people started doing serious research on the online space in these other languages, like some of the people who are going to speak today, you would find something that would be so horrifying, you'd be in shock.
Yeah.
It's interesting, and I want to toss it now to you, Jacquelyn. A question that I have is, so Facebook in Zuckerberg's testimony says Facebook's mission is to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. And I'm curious, because you spend so much time looking at the amount of misinformation, disinformation that's spreading on social media platforms, and in particular around Facebook, I'm curious how that statement matches up with what actually is happening on the platform. Curious if you can give us some insights in terms of what you're seeing.
That's a really good question, Stephen. And that really brings me to a lot of, kind of Facebook features that we use, especially groups, right? How have Facebook groups morphed from what they were intended, apparently, into this kind of vehicle to spread mis and disinformation about vaccines, COVID-19 in general, and also about false things about the election, right, being stolen and things like that with mail-in ballots, right? So we see these groups being created, and not only are they created, then when you enter these groups, you are being suggested to join others, right? That is being curbed a little bit, but it hasn't stopped, right? And we still see that spread of, even though Facebook has said that they've removed a lot of that information in order to kind of, stop this information disorder from proliferating, we still see, just a couple of weeks ago, misinformation about COVID vaccines still rapidly spreading, right? So I think that the mission statement obviously here somewhere has gotten quite lost, right? And I do not think that that is indicative of what is going on. And well, I know that it's not indicative of what's going on in 2021 or last year. So, hopefully that's something they'll discuss today.
I want to follow up on that, Jacquelyn, because I know you and I have talked quite a bit about how disinformation operates in particularly Black communities and Latinx communities, and whether or not these companies are even fully equipped to address some of those issues, whether or not the media has maybe even overblown at times, whether or not certain groups are more susceptible to disinformation than others. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Yes, I think that, at First Draft is a place that works with journalists and policymakers that work in these tech companies. They do not represent these communities they are meant to serve, right? And because of that, they're not really understanding or wanting to understand the kind of disinformation that are proliferating Black and Latinx communities. I even think about, as far as vaccine misinformation, there's been a lot of talk about vaccine hesitancy among Black and Latinx people, right? And we're seeing, different disinformation agents maybe spreading that disinformation, but for the most part, the numbers are showing and the data is showing that Black people overwhelmingly want vaccines, and so do Latinx people, right? So you have this kind of difference between what we're seeing online, this disinformation that's spreading, that's not being deleted, that's not being checked with a fact check by the CDC or by Facebook fact checkers, just allowing to proliferate across line, especially, attaching any sort of, vaccine disinformation to celebrities, trying to insinuate that they might cause death, right? This is really harmful to our communities. Another thing is with ads, we're not getting the same ads from the CDC, from the WHO, health ads in our news feeds as our white counterparts, right? But I think a study was done by the Markup, and only 3% of Black people received healthy information about COVID vaccines, right? So there's a real disparity here.
Yeah, so we have a question coming in from the chat that we'll put up here on the screen that I'd love for both of y'all to, Heidi and Jacquelyn, to kind of respond to or just reflect on. But it strikes me that in the testimonies that we're going to hear today from the top tech CEOs here, all of them are going to talk about what each of their platforms is doing to, stop the spread of misinformation, disinformation, all the content moderations that they've hired, all the solutions that they've implemented, in the lead up to the November elections. But around this question, like, it's clear that, like, based on what y'all have done, based on the research that you've done, based on the articles that we continue to see coming out, like the article that came out yesterday that shows that, militia groups are still very much active on platforms like Facebook. To Nora's question in the chat, what's a mitigating step that platforms should be taking that perhaps they haven't even thought about taking at all? And I'm curious where you all sit on that question.
Well, I'm happy to go first. I find it hard to answer like a number one thing to do. I mean, as Jacquelyn just pointed out, you've got issues with algorithms, you've got issues with ads, you've got issues with harmful groups, you've got content moderation. So I will try. Apply your rules across the board. Even if the rules have some flaws right now, it's a start. I certainly don't think they're in any way, shape, or form going to be able to do that, but it would be something. And you all are right when you say they're going to come and say that we took down 12 billion pieces of this and 12 million pieces of that. It's never going to give the context. It doesn't tell you what stays up. It seems like every single time they claim to have made a quote unquote positive step, that the next day there's a news report out, like you mentioned, Stephen, about, there's militias all over the platform still. At least try to enforce your rules as you promised.
Yeah, I agree with Heidi. And I do find it hard to state what would be the number one thing, right? Across the board would be great. And how will that happen, right? And I really see the only way this happening, the bottom line will have to be affected, right, for these platforms, for them to really take any action. So that's really the only thing that I can continuously think about, right? Because I don't see it. Yes, we have solutions. We talk about these solutions in all of our different affinity groups and with different CBOs and things like that. But, these suggestions are in vain unless, I think that, monetarily they're affected by things. So it's a tough one.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it just shows how complex the problems are. But it's something as simple as even just enforcing the rules that you have in place, like, would be great to hear these companies speak to and commit to, because we saw obviously last summer Trump, posting when the looting starts, the shooting starts, and that's a clear violation of Facebook's, policy around incitements to violence. And like, it's actually a thing that Zuckerberg is going to mention, well, the policy itself and how the policy is in place and all the wonderful language that they have in place to like prevent the spread of this sort of stuff. He's going to reference it in his testimony, but he very much like bucked their own policies in place of like, their own political interest. Just a reminder for folks, if you're just tuning in with us, you're here with us on the Big Tech on Blast watch party. Thanks for joining us. If you've just joined us also, we're doing a bingo game as part of this congressional hearing that will kick off sometime after the noon o'clock hour on the East Coast. Go to our Twitter page, pick it up, play alongside with us. It'll be fun, hopefully, if not depressing, or maybe a little bit of both. So I'm curious if we can, let's toss it back to you, Brandi. You have a question.
Yeah, I have a general question for folks. So we've seen the CEOs come together individually or collectively to do these hearings over the last year, 9 months. For any of you, what have been some of your standout moments in these testimonies where either you thought some interesting information came out from the CEOs that we were able to hold on to, or, things they didn't say that opened up conversations? And what may we expect in these hearings coming up?
Well, for me, probably the best thing that happened, I don't remember which hearing it was to see Zuckerberg get called to the mat over how much anti-Muslim hate is on the platform. It seems like a category that is never dealt with. I don't know why. It's horrific. But usually what you see is this dance to not answer questions, and also just incredibly poor Zoom sets, which always freaks me out. You would think of all the people in the world, they would have an amazing backdrop. So, I also think the hearings have gotten better in terms of congressional staff. Congressional, elected officials asking better questions. Certainly a couple of years ago, it was just sort of, they didn't seem to understand anything. So I hope they hold their feet to the fire here, because this is really screwing up our democracies, human rights. It's not a joke at the end of the day, right? This is serious business.
That's right. Well, I want to really appreciate Jacquelyn and Heidi for y'all being here. You can feel free to hang with us if you want to stay in the watch party. Otherwise, feel free to jump on off. But we actually are going to bring in another special guest here who's been waiting for us backstage. This is probably, so thank you so much, Jacquelyn. Thank you so much, Heidi. We got Joan Donovan joining us here at Boston Joan. This is probably what, your fifth live stream of today. You're just coming from the Fight for the Future live stream. Is that right? Can you hear us, Joan? There we go. You can hear us?
Yeah, and can you hear me now?
Yes.
Does this sound good? Sounds good? All right. Yeah. Can you hear me now? Just a little telephone humor. I can hear you great. I mean, you guys sound, I know.
Yeah,
good.
I think it seems like we've got a little bit of a delay going on here with you, Joan. Because you're probably dialing in from somewhere
things, that I'm excited to do today is just talk with everyone. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Feel free to take it away, Joan.
Joan, can you hear us?
I don't know how to fix that delay.
Oh,
so, yeah. I can hear you.
We just
got to
wait.
Delay, it sounds like.
Yeah. Talk to us about some of the research that you've been doing, because you've dropped a lot of incredibly important research that has really helped break open this conversation about misinformation, disinformation. So what are some of the things that you're hoping to hear come out during this hearing today? What are some things that you think that the CEOs really need to answer for as far as disinformation?
I am just over the moon that you all are doing this commentary live running. I have told every reporter I know to listen to you and to pay attention to what you guys are doing today, and to watch and listen and learn from what is happening in terms of advocacy work, because ultimately we're in this position right now because of massive inaction as profits are made time and time and time and time again. And from my perspective, the only way we're going to get at the root of the problem, which is that lots of people are making money at the expense of, quite frankly, lots of, I would say the trans community right now is under attack. Undoubtedly, one of the number one targets by some of these groups that we do not want to have, being able to attack people. And I think that Black women in particular have been targets of disinformation campaigns a lot longer than any other group. And when I say that related to the digital realm. But there's something about the historical dimension here, Brandi, that your work has always brought me back to, which is to say that there's not a lot here that's new, but the way in which the technology is being used and being leveraged by people who are making a lot of money and also harming people at huge costs to our I don't want to say democracy because it's not even that for me at this point. I mean, this is like people's ability to live, and communicate and talk with each other and get organized. And so today I'm really hoping that we get at some of the root of the problem, which is who's making the money, how much, and how long have they known that people like Bannon have been using their platforms to essentially, attack vulnerable segments of our society.
So Joan, I actually have a question for you, and you kind of alluded to this when you're saying how Bannon is using the platforms, right? We often seem to talk about these platforms in isolation of each other, like this is what Facebook is doing, this is what Twitter's doing, YouTube, and then insert whatever other platform you want here. But I wonder if you could kind of talk to us a little bit about media manipulation and what that is and how sometimes these platforms interact, and quite frankly, that how they can actually spread across multiple platforms is actually part of the problem as well.
Yeah, so this is one of the things that our research at the Shorenstein Center that Brandi has been more than immersed in has really been driving us towards some of these really important questions about what are these tactics? What do they look like? How are these groups both organized and then also able to leverage opportunities in our information ecosystem, breaking news events, as well as vulnerabilities or wedge issues within communities that then become completely out of scale with how I guess the question really is like how manipulators are able to spot debates that we all have within our communities and then leverage essentially how, frankly, white people think about different communities as being this kind of monolith that all thinks the same way. And then use things like Twitter's trending algorithms, for instance, to make it seem as if these media manipulators' opinions are the opinions of everyone in this marginalized group. And so one of the things that we saw recently that I was very aghast by was watching how a known misogynist and racist was able to get Latinx to trend on Twitter by leveraging the fact that there are members of Latino and Latinx communities who don't enjoy that spelling change. And they were able to take that wedge, which is an important debate that people want to have, and make it seem as if there was some kind of agenda setting that was being done by feminists and trans people to make it seem as if this term was much more controversial than it really is. And so we're trying to understand these questions of like how do media manipulators use these platforms and these features in order to cause these kinds of conversations where they also control almost both poles of the conversation. So it's a very inauthentic conversation. It's a very pointed and destructive one to have in a space like Twitter. And so I think it is really important to understand media manipulation tactics for what they are, which is only enabled at scale because of the design of these platforms. And I think the hearing should be starting any minute now.
Yes. I hear you, Brandi. There you go.
We have heard that there are men talking. So
I will shut up now.
Switching over
Thank you, Joan.
to the hearing right now.
join, videos they should view, and posts they should like, driving this movement forward with terrifying speed and efficiency. FBI documents show that many of these individuals used your platforms to plan, recruit, and execute this attack. According to independent research, users on Facebook were exposed 1.1 billion times to misinformation related to the election last year alone, despite changes to your policies and claims that you removed election misinformation. Our nation is in the middle of a terrible pandemic. Nearly 550,000 Americans have lost their lives to this deadly disease, more than any other country on the planet. And an independent study found that on Facebook alone, that users across 5 countries, including the United States, were exposed to COVID disinformation an estimated 3.8 billion times, again, despite claims of fixes and reforms. And now, as the Biden administration is working to implement the American Rescue Plan and get vaccines in people's arms, we are faced with waves of disinformation on social media about the safety and efficacy of these shots. These vaccines are our best chance we have to fight this virus. And the content that your websites are still promoting, still recommending, and still sharing is one of the biggest reasons people are refusing the vaccine. And things haven't changed. My staff found content on YouTube telling people not to get vaccines and was recommended to similar videos. The same was true on Instagram, where it was not only easy to find vaccine disinformation, but platforms recommended similar posts. The same thing happened on Facebook, except they also had anti-vax groups to suggest as well. And Twitter was no different. If you go to any of these super spreader accounts that remain up despite the policies meant to curb this anti-vax content, you'll see this content. Now, understand this, you can take this content down. You can reduce division. You can fix this, but you choose not to. We saw your platforms remove ISIS terrorist content. We saw you tamp down on COVID misinformation at the beginning of the pandemic. And we have seen disinformation drop when you have promoted reliable news sources and removed serial disinformation super spreaders from your platform. You have the means, but time after time, you are picking engagement and profit over the health and safety of your users, our nation, and our democracy. These are serious issues, and to be honest, it seems like you all just shrug off billion-dollar fines. Your companies need to be held accountable. We need rules, regulations, technical experts in government, and audit authority of your technologies. Ours is the committee of jurisdiction, and we will legislate to stop this. The stakes are simply too high. The chair will now recognize Mr. Latta, ranking member of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, I thank the chairman for recognizing me, and I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today for a conversation that's long overdue in the Energy and Commerce Committee. I'm deeply concerned by your decisions to operate your companies in a vague and biased manner, with little to no accountability, while using Section 230 as a shield for your actions and their real-world consequences. Your companies have the power to silence the President of the United States, shut off legitimate journalism in Australia, shut down legitimate scientific debate on a variety of issues, dictate which articles or websites are seen by Americans when they search the internet. When these actions are taken, users have little to no recourse to appeal the decision if they are aware of your actions. In most cases, we simply don't know. What does this mean for everyday Americans? We are all aware of big tech's ever-increasing censorship of conservative voices and their commitment to serve the radical progressive agenda by influencing a generation of children and removing, shutting down, or canceling any news, books, and even now toys that aren't considered woke. This is fundamentally un-American. At a recent hearing on disinformation and extremism online, Professor Turley, one of the nation's foremost experts on constitutional law, testified about the little brother problem, a problem which private entities do for the government, which it cannot legally do for itself. As of January of this year, Google has a greater than 92 market share in search. Facebook has over 2.7 billion monthly users, and Twitter has 187 million daily users. Your companies have enormous control over whose ideas are seen, read, or heard around the world. This gives you great power, and if misused, as we have seen in recent years, your actions have a ripple effect throughout the world that result in American voices being removed from the marketplace of ideas. While the little brother problem of censorship is frightening enough, other serious harms are occurring on these platforms that affect ordinary Americans. Young American children and teenagers are addicted to their devices and social media. This problem has been exacerbated by the pandemic and will only get worse if children continue to be separated from their peers and cannot learn from their teachers in a classroom. Your platforms are purposely designed to keep our children hooked to their screens. The use of social media has been linked to increased rates of depression, mental illness, cyberbullying, and suicide among America's youth. Illegal drugs continue to be sold online despite your previous commitments to solve these issues. Mr. Chairman, I do ask unanimous consent to submit a letter to the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy for the record.
Without objection,
Thank you very much. Serious problems continue to persist, and I wonder how much you are truly dedicating to combating these actions. What actions are you taking to educate Americans about the dangers of using your site, especially the dangers for our kids? As ranking member of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, we have oversight of any change made to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Section 230 provides you with liability protection for content moderation decisions made in good faith. Based on recent actions, however, it is clear that your definition of good faith moderation includes censoring viewpoints you disagree with and establishing faux independent appeals process that doesn't make its content moderation decision based on American principles of free expression. I find that highly concerning. I look forward to today's hearing as an important step in reconsidering the extent to which big tech deserves to retain the significant liability protection. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. The chair now recognizes Chair Schakowsky, chair of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to co-chair this meeting with you. I want to welcome our witnesses and thank them for coming. It is not an exaggeration to say that your companies have fundamentally and permanently transformed our very culture and our understanding of the world. Much of this is for good, but it is also true that our country, our democracy, even our understanding of what is truth has been harmed by the proliferation and dissemination of misinformation and extremism, all of which has deeply divided us. What our witnesses today need to take away from this hearing is that self-regulation has come to the end of its road, and that this democracy, this democratic, the people that you see before you, elected by the people, is preparing to move forth with legislation and regulation. The regulation that we seek should not attempt to limit constitutionally protected freedom of speech, but it must hold platforms accountable when they are used to incite violence and hatred, or, as in the case of the COVID pandemic, spread misinformation that costs thousands of lives. All three of the companies that are here today run platforms that are hotbeds of misinformation and disinformation. And despite all the promises and new policies to match, disinformation was rampant in the 2020 election, especially targeting vulnerable communities. For example, Spanish language ads run by the Trump campaign falsely accused President Biden of being endorsed by Venezuelan President Maduro. The spread of disinformation disinformation fed upon itself until it arrived at the capital of the United States on January 6th, which cost 5 lives. The lives lost in the insurgency were not the first cases of these platforms' failure, nor even the worst. In 2018, Facebook admitted a genocide of the Rohingya.
All right, I think we're gonna cut in a little bit here as Representative Chakowski from Illinois is speaking here and doing the pomp and circumstance that comes with a lot of these congressional hearings, right? Of like all of the members and ranking members saying their thing. Sound is great. Thank you so much. I mean, I think one thing that I'm surprised by so far, I don't know that any of us had woke by Rob Latta on our bingo cards. So that is definitely surprising right off the bat. But I'm curious as we heard from like the chair and the ranking member in the House subcommittee on telecommunications and communications, or communications and technology. That's what it is. I'm curious what stood out to you all, and maybe I'll kick it over to you, Joan, first to give us your thoughts.
Yeah, I just want to double check you can hear me better now.
Yeah, totally.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean the laying out the harms, letting people know that we were paying attention when we saw some advertising that was being hyper targeted at Latinx communities, letting this part of the hearing really lays the groundwork for statements of record that can then be called upon. One of the things that's going to be interesting to see in this hearing, of course, is going to be exactly what we're talking about earlier. Carmen was making the insight about what they're willing to say on the record related to the kind of statistics and whatnot, or their grand vision. And one of the things that I think we need to be prepared for on the horizon is, a kind of disinformation defense organizing strategy, advocacy strategy that is going to help us get around some of the major claims that none of us, not even the tech platforms, can even prove. So when we hear things like, we removed 94% of hate speech on our platform, as a sociologist, I'm like, but what's the denominator there? Like, how much didn't you catch to be able to make that statistic? And so don't get wowed by these statistics, rather understand what they are, which is their PR. Statistics need to come from a place in which we all have visibility into the data that they're deriving their answers from. And so I'll be interested to see where those things end up landing and how Congress questions that. And I want to know one other thing. How much money have they made off of disinformation, right? Like, this is an industry and it's a big one.
Thank you. And if you're just tuning in, you're watching Big Tech on Blast. I don't have my sound effects right now because, this is like me producing the Academy Awards. I have, see, I love it. Thank you, Joan. You always come through. You're watching Big Tech on Blast, the live stream here, and I want to pass it over to Carmen, but just want to note the hearing has started. All the politicians are doing their opening statements, and soon enough we will cut away to the actual tech CEOs in a bit. So Carmen, what stood out to you in the first few moments here?
Yeah, I mean, so far, right, we can see that they're talking about how the self-regulating of the companies has to stop, or that we've gone to the end of our rope, and now is the time for regulations, for legislation, for something that actually holds them accountable. And jumping onto what Joan said, how much money have they made off of disinformation? I think that's a great question. But also, why don't we do the flip side? How much money have they put into preventing disinformation? Right? Because what seems to be happening here, right, is that they talk about not how they prevent this from happening, but what they do after the fact to remove things. And kind of, what they're doing here is removing evidence of their toxic business models, right? So they're saying like, yeah, we know that we recommend this stuff. We know that this lives on our platform and there's all these groups that are pushing it. And maybe we'll do the cleanup on the, on the back end, and then we'll tell you that we're doing this cleanup. And then also we just don't know how toxic it really is. Getting to Joan's point about the denominator, they say they do all these great things, but they're grading their own homework, right? They're telling us we're doing such a great job. Aren't you proud of us? When we don't really know, how bad it really is, because we just can't grasp, the scale of this issue. And even they, again, will obscure what these numbers really mean. So, that's something that's, stood out to me. And I would love to hear them say how much money they're putting into preventing their algorithms, preventing their platforms, the architecture of the way these, these things work on their platforms, from actually pushing these, this disinformation and misinformation onto their users.
What about for you, Brandi? What stood out in these opening moments here?
Yeah, so unfortunately I missed a significant portion of the opening. So I popped in and immediately heard Hunter Biden, and I was like, oh, here we go. This is very much striking me as a continuation of the conversation last year, where this provably false perception of conservative bias or ideological bias is this thing that trumps the regular civil rights violations and things that happen on the platform. Like, if we want to talk about censorship and silencing, fine, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the fact that Black women particularly are some of the most censored people on the platform. Let's talk about the different ways in which content moderation routinely fails across the board. But the fact that it's immediately we're coming off of the January 6th insurrection, we're coming off of a lot of things that have taken place in front of our public eye, and the first thing that's getting latched onto is this discussion about conservative bias, when I think most of the top articles circulated in the 2020 news cycle on Facebook were from conservative outlets, is just absurd to me. And I actually would like to hear how some of that framing is going to really be challenged in some of the questions that we're hearing from some of the other members of Congress.
Yeah, that'll definitely be interesting, because that feels like such a tired trope in this conversation with social media platforms, in the face of all the evidence that is completely the opposite. Facebook and Twitter and in particular YouTube and Facebook are really good for amplifying right-wing extremist views, amplifying and helping white militias, white supremacists mobilize and organize online. And it takes me back to some of the work that we all did, advocating and pushing Facebook to conduct an independent civil rights audit. And when they finally agreed to it in 2018, in the aftermath of Cambridge Analytica, it happened, and they released it in paired with an announcement that they were going to do a conservative bias report. And it just, that was one of the initial of many gut punches that would come in our advocacy with Facebook. And I'm curious, since we're about to hear from the tech CEOs, Carmen, Brandi, Joan, you all have engaged directly with a lot of the top execs, a lot of engineers, a lot of policy people. What's been your experience working with these companies and trying to get them to do the right thing? And we'll cut away. We may have to cut away if the tech CEOs start talking.
Yeah,
and we can kick it to you, Joan. Yeah.
I would want to interrupt their time, but I think that it's really important that we understand that even Congress knows that this is a bit of a show, and the feeling I get from the Hill is they want this to be one of the last times that we're dealing with these folks. It's very curious to me that YouTube didn't send their CEO, but rather Pachai is there, which means there's going to be a lot of "I'll get back to you." And when it comes to the environment at a place like Facebook, the reason why BuzzFeed is getting all of these really amazing leaks is because of the toxic culture in these companies where, frankly, the employees want things to be better. And there's a lot of great movement organizing being done around that with coworker, and I just wonder how long a company can be sustainable at this level where you have a lot of people that are in there that need their jobs and can't quit, right? It's not the case that they have, it's not the case that you're an engineer and you can just work anywhere you want. They're kind of stuck in a working class moment where they do make a lot of money, but you have to make a lot of money to live in that area and to do that kind of work. And so it's a tough situation for the employees to be in, and those are the people that I've engaged with the most around, well, how do we get technology in alignment with society in such a way that technology is a support and not a massive and damaging force. And right now, I think the employees are the most important people to engage with, rather than the CEOs. And I think that that's where it's going to be telling if we have another one of these kind of hearings or not in the future. But if I were to lay my bets on if things change, it's going to be because the employees make it so.
Great, and I think we're going to start seeing one of the tech bros start talking pretty soon. But curious, any last words before we jump back into the broadcast from Brandi or Carmen?
So I do want to quickly say, one of the first hearings with Mark Zuckerberg actually had a direct impact on us even being able to do the civil rights audit, because we were able to plan a question with Senator Booker, pressing Mark Zuckerberg and getting him on record to commit to actually doing a civil rights audit. So with the right questioning and pinning down of these CEOs, there can be something that comes out of that. So that would be one of the things that I'm looking for today.
Yeah, for sure. And we still got here Representative, I believe this is it Representative Pallone who's talking? And is that right? Yeah. Hopefully I got that right. Yeah, awesome. Thank you for the confirmation. And I think we can cut back to them, since I think the tech CEOs are about to start talking pretty soon. Joan, if we don't catch you on the flip side of this, I just want to thank you so much. Also want to note, Joan, that you announced this week, because I joined one of the many live streams you've been on, that you're going to be working on a book about disinformation. So any quick shout out around that you want to give, or any preview of folks, or where folks can be in touch with you?
Me, Brian Friedberg, and Emily Dreyfus on my team, thanks to Brandi, met an incredible person that helped us get a book deal. And so we're going to be writing Drafted into the Meme Wars, about the last 10 years of essentially online political discourse, starting with just a bit of a prehistory before Occupy. And one thing that's been kind of interesting, and this is the nerd in me, I had forgotten that Occupy pulled a hoax saying that Radiohead was going to play at Zuccotti Park at 4 p.m. and
I
made
remember that.
thousands of people go. And it was total shenanigans. And that's where it all started. And so I'm really excited to tell stories like that, histories like that, and also really excited to read all of the amazing research that Brandi's been doing for her book that's also going to be coming out, Black Skinhead. So, like, I don't know. I just feel like big things are happening, even as we're struggling with technology and the role that it plays in our daily lives. I am just so proud of the sort of legacy of media justice and the work of free press and the great research that's been coming out. And grift, scams, hoaxes, all that stuff's not going to go away, even if we get the right rules in place with regulation. And certainly neither is misogyny, racism, LGBTQ hate, religious intolerance. And so we're always going to be here working on these issues together. And that's going to be the one thing that I think is going to get us through, is the work we do together and how we make these issues matter, and in the work we do with one another and in our communities. And so I'm excited for all that. I'm writing a book, but it's not going to be a nerd book. It's going to be a nerdy book, which is to say, if you love memes and all that nonsense, we're going to start there, and then we're going to hopefully by the end of it give people an understanding of how we can do more and better advocacy and political communication and research about the internet. And that to me is the dream.
We got so many people in the chat saying they're going to buy these books. We got a bunch of pre-sales going on in the chat right now in the Big Tech on Blast live stream.
Well,
So I've already said it to Brandi. I've already said it to Brandi. I'm going to say it to you, future New York Times bestselling authors. I'm so lucky to have you on here. I think we're going to cut back to the hearing and play a little bit more, and we'll jump back in if some BS starts to get said that we need to interject. So thanks so much for being on here with us, Joan.
Oh, and I just want to say, if you're on Twitter, follow Hypervisible is going to be tweeting about this. Chris Gillard and Brandi Zadronsny and NBC News is going to be covering this as well. And so those folks are definitely going to be people that you want to tap into because they're going to have great critique. So yeah, it's going to be great.
That's right. All right.
I might dip back in later if things get wild. I get angry.
You got the link.
And I do. So we'll see you soon. Peace.
Suicides and suicide attempts exploded among American teens. During that time, rates of teen depression increased more than 60%, with a larger increase among young girls. Between 2009 and 15, emergency room admissions for self-harm among 10 to 14-year-olds tripled, and suicide substantially increased. One study found during that time, teens who used their devices for 5 or more hours a day were 66% more likely to have at least one suicide-related outcome compared to those who use their device for just one. Other studies have found that teens who spend more time online report lower psychological well-being and more feelings of loneliness. Remember, our kids, the users, are the product. You, big tech, are not advocates for children. You exploit and profit off of them. Big tech needs to be exposed and completely transparent for what you are doing to our children, so parents like me can make informed decisions. We also expect big tech to do more to protect children because you haven't done enough. Big tech has failed to be good stewards of your platforms. I have 2 daughters and a son with a disability. Let me be clear. I do not want you defining what is true for them. I do not want their future manipulated by your algorithms. I do not want their self-worth defined by the engagement tools you built to attract their attention. I do not want them to be in danger from what you've created. I do not want their emotions and vulnerabilities taken advantage of so you can make more money and have more power. I'm sure most of my colleagues on this committee who are parents and grandparents feel the same way. Over 20 years ago, before we knew what big tech would become, Congress gave you liability protections. I want to know, why do you think you still deserve those protections today? What will it take for your business model to stop harming children? I know I speak for millions of moms when I say we need answers, and we will not rest until we get them. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. The chair would now like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made a part of the record. I would now like to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing and thank them all for appearing today. First, we have Mark Zuckerberg, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Facebook, Sundar Pichai, Chief Executive Officer of Google, and Jack Dorsey, Chief Executive Officer of Twitter. We want to thank all 3 of you for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony. Each of you will have 5 minutes to give your opening statements. Mr. Zuckerberg, we'll start with you. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairs Palone, Schakowsky, and Doyle, ranking members Rogers, Latta, and Bilirakis, and members of the committee. I'm glad that this committee is looking at all the ways that misinformation and disinformation show up in our country's discourse. There are important challenges here for our society, and we have to decide how we want to handle speech that is legal but harmful, and who should be responsible for what people say. Misinformation is not a new problem. It was 200 years ago that a congressman said that a lie would travel from Maine to Georgia while truth was still getting on his boots. And disinformation has often been spread through traditional media too. But the internet gives everyone the power to communicate, and that certainly presents unique challenges. Now, people often say things that aren't verifiably true, but that speak to their lived experiences. And I think we have to be careful restricting that. For example, if someone feels intimidated or discriminated against while voting, I believe that they should be able to share their experience, even if the election overall was fair. Now, I don't think anyone wants a world where you can only say things that private companies judge to be true, where every text message, email, video, and post has to be fact-checked before you hit send. But at the same time, we also don't want misinformation to spread that undermines confidence in vaccines, stops people from voting, or causes other harms. At Facebook, we do a lot to fight misinformation. We remove content that could lead to imminent real-world harm. We've built an unprecedented third-party fact-checking program, and if something is rated false, then we add warning labels and significantly reduce its distribution. We invest a lot in directing billions of people to authoritative information. The system isn't perfect, but it's the best approach that we've found to address misinformation in line with our country's values. It's not possible to catch every piece of harmful content without infringing on people's freedoms in a way that I don't think that we'd be comfortable with as a society. Our approach was tested in 2020 when we took extraordinary steps during an extraordinary election. We removed voting misinformation, banned hundreds of militias and conspiracy networks, including QAnon, labeled posts that prematurely or wrongly declared victory, and directed people to official results. We labeled over 180 million posts. We directed 140 million people to our official voting information center, and we helped 4.5 million people register to vote. We did our part to secure the integrity of the election. And then, on January 6th, President Trump gave a speech rejecting the results and calling on people to fight. The attack on the Capitol was an outrage, and I want to express my sympathy to all of the members, staff, and Capitol workers who had to live through this disgraceful moment in our history. And I want to express my gratitude to the Capitol Police who were on the front lines in defense of our democracy. Now, I believe that the former president should be responsible for his words, and that the people who broke the law should be responsible for their actions. So that leaves the question of the broader information ecosystem. And I can't speak for everyone else, the TV channels, radio stations, news outlets, websites, and other apps, but I can tell you what we did. Before January 6th, we worked with law enforcement to identify and address threats. During and after the attack, we provided extensive support in identifying the insurrectionists and removed posts supporting violence. We didn't catch everything, but we made our services inhospitable to those who might do harm. And when we feared that he would incite further violence, we suspended the former president's account. Now, many people are concerned that platforms can ban elected leaders. I am too. I don't think that private companies should make so many decisions like this alone. We need an accountable process, which is why we created an independent oversight board that can overrule our decisions. And we need democratically agreed rules for the internet. The reality is our country is deeply divided right now, and that isn't something that tech companies alone can fix. And we all have a part to play in helping to turn things around, and I think that starts with taking a hard look at how we got here. Now, some people say that the problem is that social networks are polarizing us, but that's not at all clear from the evidence or research. Polarization was rising in America long before social networks were even invented, and it's falling or stable in many other countries where social networks are popular. Others claim that algorithms feed us content that makes us angry because it's good for business, but that's not accurate either. I believe that the division we see today is primarily the result of a political and media environment that drives Americans apart, and we need to reckon with that if we're going to make progress. Now, I know that technology can help bring people together. We see it every day on our platforms. Facebook is successful because people have a deep desire to connect and share, not to stand apart and fight. And we believe that connectivity and togetherness are more powerful ideals than division and discord, and that technology can be part of the solution to the challenges our society is facing. And we are ready to work with you to move beyond hearings and get started on real reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg. Now, Mr. Pichai, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Cool. I think we're going to cut back in here for just a couple minutes.
Mr. Pichai,
And I want to make sure
are you unmuted?
we got the audio lowered a little bit here so we can jump back in. All right. So obviously we just heard from Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO at Facebook, and Sundar Pichai from Google is about to talk. We'll cut back to him really briefly, but just curious, Brandi, Carmen, what are some of the things that jumped out at you in that initial opening statement? Anything different here that we should note?
I don't know if there's anything different here. I mean, I made some notes here of what Zuckerberg was saying, where he says, we could, do you want a world where private companies are determining what is true? That's what they do with their content moderation, right? And it's not just about truth. I mean, if you look through their policies, and I've been digging into these, for months now, their community standards or terms of service, they control everything on their platform. So everything that's on there is their responsibility. So for them to say, like, do you really want us controlling it? They already are. So I think that's just, that's a disingenuous to say that. And, all these actions that he's saying that they take, they're all after the fact. So I was thinking about this, it's after violence occurs. It's after we've seen deaths, after a genocide, right? And, they always react and they never prevent. And so that's, again, that's something that we have to think about as he talks here and responds to questions today.
That's right. And he places the blame on the political and media environment when very much they've played a role in the, in the discourse that we're living in. And there's been studies and multiple reports that kind of point to that. I want to bring in a couple guests because we're going to grow the party a little bit. I'm excited to bring on, we've got Bridget Todd, who's the communications director at UltraViolet. But one other wonderful thing you should know about Bridget is also the host of a podcast called There Are No Girls on the Internet, and is currently working on a mini series called Disinformed, where in your latest episode, you spoke with Evan Greer, a good friend of ours from Fight for the Future, about Section 230. How you doing, Bridget? And for some reason, Bridget, we cannot hear you.
Is that better?
There we go.
Hello. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. So excited to be here.
Awesome. And the other person we're going to invite into the party here is Jelani Drew-Davi, who's the campaign manager at Kairos Fellows. Longtime digital organizer. We've known Jelani from multiple iterations, from their time at Credo Action, or even at Fight for the Future. How you doing, Jelani?
Hey y'all, how y'all doing? This is super cool as well. I've been like, this is produced. I love the sound effects. I'm here for it.
This is like the Watch What Happens Live for platform accountability.
Absolutely.
Does that make you the Andy Cohen?
Yes, I can be that. I'll play the part. It's so good to have you both here. I'm curious your initial reactions here and listening to Zuck open up with his opening statement. What stood out to you all?
Well, for me, it was, the lies. Speaking of Real Housewives, I think of Candy Burris, that iconic clip, the lies. It's really almost difficult to point out all of the half-truths and distortions that he made. And it's so interesting to me how all of them are made to really weasel out of direct accountability. He talks about, the political system and the media system have done all this harm to our democracy, as if he is not directly involved in shaping those two systems. It's also really funny to me that he talked about how he worked to make Facebook a platform that was inhospitable to those who might seek to distort and do harm. Unless we're talking about Alex Jones, with whom we know that he personally interfered to keep him on the platform, despite breaking rules and spreading distortions and harm. So honestly, just a master class in using lies and PR doublespeak and distortions to avoid any kind of accountability. But what else is new?
That's right. What about for you, Jelani?
Yeah, I mean, basically the same. I was like, lies, Liza Minnelli lies. Like, it is really wild. And I think that also the interesting thing is that he continues to say the same thing. Every time we see him, every time we see an article with Zuckerberg. And the thing is, like, you can go point for point what he says and have many, many types of other sources saying that what he's saying is not true. From, you know, employees to advertisers to actual users. It's just really wild to me that he'll get up here and say the same thing. So, you know, we'll see what our other CEO friends have to say as well.
Well, why don't we jump back into that then? It seems like Jack Dorsey is dialing in somewhere from Burning Man at this current moment. So let's go ahead and jump back into to Jack speaking, and hoping that Bridget and Jelani, you'll stick with us, and we'll be back on the
conversation to find the truth. At the same time, we must balance that with our desire for our service not to be used to sow confusion, division, or destruction. This makes the freedom to moderate content critical to us. Our process to moderate content is designed to constantly evolve. We observe what's happening on our service, we work to understand the ramifications, and we use that understanding to strengthen our operations. We push ourselves to improve based on the best information we have. Much of what we're likely to discuss today are entirely new situations the world has never experienced before, and in some unique cases involve elected officials. And we believe the best way to face a big new challenge is through narrowing the problem to have the greatest impact. Disinformation is a broad concept. We needed to focus our approach on where we saw the greatest risk if we hope to have any impact at all. So we chose to focus on disinformation leading to offline harm, and 3 categories to start: manipulated media, public health, and civic integrity. Many of you will have strong opinions on how effective we are in this work. Some of you will say we're doing too much and removing free speech rights. Some of you will say we're not doing enough and end up causing harm. Both points of view are reasonable, and we're exploring. If we woke up tomorrow and decided to stop moderating content, we'd end up with a service very few people or advertisers would want to use. Ultimately, we're running a business, and a business wants to grow the number of customers it serves. Enforcing policy is a business decision. Different businesses and services will have different policies, some more liberal than others. And we believe it's critical this variety continues to exist. Forcing every business to behave the same reduces innovation and individual choice, and diminishes free marketplace ideals. If instead we woke up tomorrow and decided to ask the government to tell us what content to take down or leave up, we may end up with a service that couldn't be used to question the government. This is a reality in many countries today and is against the right of an individual. This would also have the effect of putting enormous resource requirements on businesses and services, which would further entrench only those who are able to afford it. Smaller businesses would not be able to compete, and all activity would be centralized into very few businesses. So how do we resolve these 2 viewpoints? One way is to create shared protocols. Social media has proven itself important enough to be worthy of an internet protocol, one that a company like Twitter can contribute to and compete on creating experiences people love to use. We've started work on such a protocol, which we call Blue Sky. It intends to act as a decentralized, open source social media protocol, not owned by any single company or organization. Any developer around the world can help develop it, just as any company can access its services. How does an open protocol address the concerns raised here? Greater transparency is the strongest benefit. Anyone around the world can see everything that's happening in the network, including exactly how it works. One doesn't have to trust a company, just look at the source code. Second, since the base protocol is shared, it will increase innovation around business models, recommendation algorithms, and moderation controls, which are in the hands of individuals rather than private companies. This will allow people to experiment in a market-based approach. Finally, it will allow all of us to observe, acknowledge, and address any societal issues that arise much faster. Having more eyes on the problems will lead to more impactful solutions that can be built directly into this protocol, making the network far more secure and resilient. A decentralized open source protocol for social media is our vision and work for the long term. We continue the cycle mentioned earlier of constantly improving our approach to content moderation in the short term. I hope our discussion today will focus on more enduring solutions. One final note, we are a bunch of humans with a desire to make the world around us better for everyone living today and those that come after us. We make mistakes in prioritization and in execution. We commit to being open about these and doing our best to remedy what we control. We appreciate the enormous privilege we have in building technologies to host some of the world's most important conversations. And we honor the desire to create better outcomes for everyone who interacts with them. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Well, we have concluded witness opening statements. At this time, we will move to member questions. I want to make sure that members are aware that our witnesses are being assisted by counsel, and during questions, our witnesses may briefly mute themselves to seek advice of counsel, which is permitted. Each member will have 5 minutes to start asking questions of our witnesses. I ask everyone to please adhere to that 5-minute rule, as we have many people that want to ask questions. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Gentlemen, who's speaking?
Jeff Duncan, point of order.
Yes,
sir. All right. We're going to jump back in here now that we've heard from Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter. A lot of wonderful chatter going on in the comments here for the live stream, trying to figure out where Jack Dorsey is calling in from. There's some guesses here that it's a WeWork kitchen. It might have been that. But I'm curious y'all's thoughts here as we hear from Twitter. What stood out to you in Dorsey's testimony? And I'm also curious, now that we've heard, we missed, actually, unfortunately, we missed Pat Chai's testimony, but we have it written, and I think most of us have seen it at this point. But I'm curious, now that we've heard all three, like, what's standing out to us about perhaps some of the similarities in terms of how they're positioning themselves, but where are we seeing differences between the platforms and how they're positioning themselves and what they're calling on members of Congress to do? But why don't we kick it to you, Jelani, to kick us off, and then we'll go do a little round robin.
Yeah, absolutely. I find that, all three of these companies are kind of positioning themselves as like, we're just the platforms. We just give the space to the people. And one of the things that we talk a lot about at Kairos is tech is not neutral. And I think that idea of, these platforms being neutral, these CEOs being neutral is something that is a thread through all of these opening statements, that they just see themselves as hands off. And I think that that's obviously problematic, because things then happen on the platforms that translate into offline violence, offline hate, and those sort of things. So that's just one of the things that I saw as a thread through all of them.
What about for you, Bridget? What stood out?
I see the same thread that Jelani noted. Completely agree with that. I also think with Jack's testimony there, it's interesting to me how Jack really said a lot without really saying much of anything. Another thing that I really noted there was, I think especially with Twitter, it seems like they always have some flashy new thing that's going to make the platform better, that they're just excited to roll out, and this is going to be the thing that helps. And whether it's their new disinformation forum or some sort of new thing, it just seems like always spinning their wheels and focusing on this new solution they have to tackle these problems that have been on their platform since day one. And so it was really interesting to me how in that testimony, Jack Dorsey said so much without really saying anything. And it was good to get a reminder that he's a human. So I appreciated him reminding us of that.
Yes, because of course, if you have to say you're human, then of course you are. It's so interesting because I think all of them probably also pointed to their actions around Trump as like, look at the good that we're doing and how we decided to step in this kind of key moment. It reminds me of something you said, Carmen, earlier, which is like, they decide to take action once everything has happened. Like, and this to me, like misinformation, disinformation, like it's kind of at a scale of a problem similarly to out here in California, we deal with wildfires. I don't think the response to like the solution towards wildfires is like, well, we should have more water available for us next time so that we can try to take down the fires a little more quickly, or set up some sprinklers so that as fires start popping up that we can tackle the fires a little more readily, easily at earlier stages. Like that's terrible. That's a terrible response to wildfires. And here we see platforms saying, look at all the stuff we're doing to catch it once it's already on the platform, once it's already spread, once it's already had an impact. I'm going to toss it to my co-host here, Carmen and Brandi, for your thoughts, but just want to remind folks, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to and watching the Big Tech on Blast watch party. That's right. I brought back my sound effects because, like a true host, I change outfits, I change rooms. Even my rooms have rooms. So we're in this watch party, where folks are watching right now in the background is some of the political theater that goes on in these congressional hearings. And we've already gotten our first yes, no question from one of the members of Congress. They do this thing where they'll ask a question and they only want the person to respond yes or no. We've already seen a round of that. It looks like they're starting to talk about COVID-19, health misinformation. So as I pass it to my colleagues, Carmen and Brandi, I should note, Brandi, you worked on a seminal research report or a paper that you released early on in the pandemic called Canaries in the Coal Mine, looking at the spread of misinformation in Black communities around COVID. So I'm curious if you can talk about that, because it seems relevant to what these folks are talking about here. And at some point, we'll cut back to the hearing. But Carmen and Brandi, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. So yeah, early on in the pandemic, we saw that these tech companies were really flubbing their responses on the amount of disinformation that was circulating around COVID, whether or not Black people were susceptible to COVID, and what were, some of the quote unquote cures or ways to deal with the issue of COVID. And part of it was actually driven by the fact that I had sat in a meeting with Twitter when we first saw all of this stuff breaking out, and told Twitter, you have a disinformation problem. There's a lot of people on here saying that Black people cannot get COVID. What are you going to do about it? And basically Twitter was like, oh, we don't think that's a legitimate problem. And it really took them a while to address that. So that was part of what fueled me to write this paper. Now, I will say the interesting thing about it is that credit where credit is due. I actually think Twitter has been one of the more proactive actors in the last year in dealing with disinformation. They were the first major tech platform to remove Trump. They also aren't at the size and scale as Facebook and Google, YouTube. So it is a bit interesting. He at least gets credit for that, but his whole I'm a human and I care about transparency, followed by let me rattle off a bunch of tech wonk fixes of what we're gonna do that actually doesn't feel super transparent at all. It is very bizarre the different ways in which each of these CEOs are presenting and tackling this issue of disinformation on their platform. Carmen, I'm not sure what you think about this.
Yeah, I mean, I actually really like, Stephen, your analogy about the wildfires and maybe let's invest more money in water, but let's not examine what is starting the flame to begin with. Let's not put any money into preventing it from happening, from the start. And I think that's what these companies lack, right? Is that examination of and apparently the lack of will to even look into what's causing these problems from their, and how their technology is driving this. So I really think that's actually a really helpful analogy to think about how these tech platforms are tackling these issues of misinformation and disinformation. And Jack here was saying, we really care about transparency. So while he was saying that, I actually went to Twitter's Transparency Center because this is the things that I do. And I looked and, it's, take it for what it is, but the numbers that they have up are through just June of 2020. And here we are in March of 2021, and we have no concept of what their transparency is and how many accounts they took down between July of 2020 and December 2020, right? And so I think, you can talk a big game and say we care about transparency, but when you actually look, that's just not what they're providing. So I think there's something to dig in there, and I hope people, I hope members of Congress see it for what it is.
That's right. I'm curious, before we jump back into the hearing and listen to some of this political theater play out a little bit more. I think 2:30 is coming up here from Bob Latta's point. So let me kick it to you, Bridget. You just did an episode with Evan Greer on Section 230. what are some of the things that you kind of picked up from that conversation? I know that you've also had a previous guest, I can't remember who it was, who was very pro like making some changes to 230. Evan was clearly like on the opposite end of that spectrum. So curious if you could expand on what you've learned.
Yeah, thank you for that. Evan Greer, A Fight for the Future, was very much in favor of preserving Section 230. Earlier in the season, we spoke to attorney Carrie Goldberg, who basically is the reason why things like revenge porn are considered the heinous crimes that they are. She was the attorney in a very well-known case against Grindr, where a man was being harassed via Grindr, and Grindr kind of refused to do anything. And so she basically challenged that, turned that into a challenge against Section 230, saying, hey, we need to be able to hold platforms accountable. From my conversation with Evan Greer, I think the thing that was really clear to me is that there are so many different positions on Section 230, like thoughtful folks on all sides have good positions on it. The problem is that when these positions sort of, the oxygen kind of gets taken out of the room by folks like Trump, who just tweet like, Section 230, and then a million exclamation points, right? We were no longer able to have this like thoughtful, substantive conversation about what Section 230 means and what we should do about it, and the real harms that tech has been responsible for when, you know, cable news gets involved and the story sort of becomes something different. And so, you know, I if you listen to that episode, I really kind of struggle with personally like where I align in terms of Section 230. But what is clear is that we need to be able to even just have the thoughtful, meaningful conversation about it. And we're not able to do that when bad actors turn it into sort of, you know, political theater or like talking points.
That's right. Thank you so much for that. And would to highly encourage folks to check out the Disinformed series. There Are No Girls on the Internet. Bridget, Todd, host extraordinaire. It's a great podcast series. Jelani, before we jump back into to the hearing here, I'm curious, like, is there a question that you would hope that for folks who maybe perhaps are on the more progressive end of the spectrum in these committees are going to be asking these tech CEOs, like, what's something that you wish they would hold them to task around?
Oh, so many questions. I think I would love for someone to just point blank ask the question. You do know you're making money off of really harmful things, right? And so that we can just get that answer. Do they care that people use their platform to spread harmful lies, or is this just business for them? And then specifically around YouTube, and I think, Carmen, you mentioned this earlier on, YouTube is entirely missing from this conversation. Like, Pichai is on, but not YouTube CEO. The amount of disinformation that flows through YouTube is incredible. And I loved YouTube. I know that like you can go down the rabbit hole. And so I would really love for them to really go down into YouTube, because we know about Facebook, we know about Twitter. The missing link here is YouTube. So those are some of the things.
Stephen, I think you're on mute.
Here I am doling out instructions and stuff. So just a reminder, folks are tuning in to the Big Tech on Blast watch party. Yes, we've got sound effects. I think we're going to kick it back into the hearing just to listen to a little bit more of this political theater, and then we'll jump back in with some more analysis. And I think Bridget and Jelani, y'all are still with us for a few more minutes. So hopefully we'll keep the conversation going with y'all. And if for whatever reason you
And from that perspective, I think that there's further work that we need to do to make our services and moderation more effective.
I
one of the things that
I hear that. Okay, I'm going to ask Mr. Pichai a question. Many companies have used Section 230 as a shield to escape consumer protection laws. And I have a bill that would actually not protect companies that do that. And so, Mr. Pichai, would you agree that that would be a proper use to not allow liability protection for those who violate consumer protection laws?
Congresswoman, consumer protection laws are very important in many areas, like we comply with COPPA and HIPAA. I think the right approach is to have legislation in applicable areas and have us.
Okay, I'm going to have to interrupt again. Is that a yes? That if a law has been broken, a consumer protection law, that there would not be liability protection under Section 230 for you?
We rely on the liability protections to actually take strong action in particularly new types of content. When the Christchurch shooting happens, within a few minutes, our teams have to make decisions about the content to take down. That certainty is what we rely on. But I agree with you that we should have strong consumer protection laws and be subject to it, and have agencies like the FTC have clear oversight over those laws and how we comply with them.
Let me just ask a real yes or thank you, a real yes or no quickly. Do you think that when you take money to run advertisements that promote disinformation, that you are exempt from liability? Yes or no? Yes or no?
Section 230.
Mr. Zuckerberg, yes or no?
Congresswoman, I don't know the legal answer to that, but we don't allow misinformation in our ads. And any ad that's been fact-checked as false, we don't allow to run as an ad.
Okay, and Mr. Dorsey?
Again, I also would need to review the legal precedent for it, but we would not allow that.
Okay, and Mr. Pichai?
We are subject to FTC's deceptive ad practices, so there are statutes which apply to us. We removed over 3 billion bad ads last year alone.
Okay, let me ask one more question. Do you think that Section 230 should be expanded to trade agreements that are being made, as happened in the U.S. Trade agreement with Mexico and Canada? Yes or no? Mr. Zuckerberg.
Congresswoman, my primary goal would be to help update Section 230 to reflect the kind of modern reality and what we've learned over 25 years. But that said, I do still think that Section 230 plays a foundational role in the development of the internet and new companies getting built. So I do think that we should support it.
I'm talking now about trade agreements, Mr. Pichai.
Congresswoman, there's value in it, but if there are evolution of Section 230, that should apply. And so in a flexible way, being able to do that would be good, I think.
Mr. Dorsey.
I don't fully understand the ramifications of what you're suggesting, so we'd have to review that.
I'm saying to have a liability shield that would be international and ratified in trade agreements, and I think it's a bad idea.
Okay, gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Bilirakis, subcommittee on ranking member of the subcommittee on consumer protection and commerce, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Mr. Dorsey, you have heard briefly about what I'm hearing from, again, in my district, my opening remarks, you've heard them. The other key part with these stories that we're hearing when we conduct these surveys is how we empower law enforcement. In a hearing last year, we received testimony that since 2016, Twitter has intentionally curtailed sharing threat data with law enforcement fusion centers. Here's the question. You're well aware that on Twitter and Periscope, that traffic has increased from bad actors seeking to groom children for molestation, lure females into sex trafficking, sell illegal drugs, incite violence, and even threaten to murder police officers. Are you willing to reinstate this cooperation, retain evidence, and provide law enforcement the tools to protect our most vulnerable? Yes or no?
Well, first, child sexual exploitation has no place on our platform, and I don't believe that's true. We work with local law enforcement regularly.
So you're saying that this is not true? What I'm telling you. Are you willing to reinstate? In other words, it's not going on now. Reinstate this cooperation with law enforcement to retain evidence and provide law enforcement the tools to protect our most vulnerable.
We would love to work with you in more detail on what you're seeing, but we work with law enforcement regularly. We have a strong partnership.
So you're saying that this is not true, what I'm telling you?
I don't believe so, but like we'd love to understand the specifics.
Well, you commit to doing what I'm telling you you're not doing in the future, and work with me on this.
We'll commit to continue doing what we are doing.
And what is that? You're saying that
working.
So in other words,
local law enforcement.
Okay. Well, let me go on to the next question, but I'm going to follow up with this to make sure you're doing this. I mean, our children's lives are in jeopardy here. Mr. Zuckerberg, we have heard you acknowledge mistakes about your products before. There are now media reports of an Instagram for under 13 being launched. My goodness. Between this and YouTube Kids, you and Mr. Pachai have obviously identified a business case for targeting this age bracket with content, and I find that very concerning, targeting this particular age bracket, 13 and under. Given these free services, how exactly will you be making money, or are you trying to monetize our children too and get them addicted early? And will you be allowing your own children to use this site with the default settings? We're talking about the site that apparently is being launched for children under 13 and under, or under 13 actually. Can you please answer that question for me?
Congressman, we're early in thinking through how this service would work. There is clearly a large number of people under the age of 13 who would want to use a service like Instagram. We currently do not allow them to do that. I think
what would be the purpose? What would be beneficial? What would be beneficial to our children to launch this kind of service?
Well, Congressman, I think helping people stay connected with friends and learn about different content online is broadly positive. There are clearly issues that need to be thought through and worked out, including how parents can control the experience of kids, especially kids under the age of 13. And we haven't worked through all that yet.
Back in here. So here we have Zuckerberg talking about a Teen IG product that they're working on, which is clearly not in response to TikTok being such a popular tool among the young kids. And I think one interesting thing, I think, in this line of questioning that we've seen back and forth with this representative, Bilirakis, I believe is how you pronounce it, Gus Bilirakis from Florida, is he goes into this whole rant about sex trafficking and pornography and child trafficking that's going on Twitter and stuff. And I guess the interesting thing for me, I'm curious y'all's take on this, but like when I'm hearing him talk about that and grill Jack Dorsey about it, I'm like, wasn't this the whole point of Sesta Fosta of like adjusting Section 230 to like clamp down on like child sex trafficking that's happening on social media platforms by removing like exemptions or adjusting Section 230? Like here we have the same justification being brought up again in the context of like regulating the platforms, but it's such whatever Sesta Fosta was supposed to have done around these things clearly didn't work out. And in fact, like we've heard from a lot of advocates in the sex worker space that what it's actually done is forced and led to the platforms overcompensating because of that law and just taking down all types of content, not just like the stuff that was intended initially. But curious what's jumping out for you both, Carmen and Brandi, as you hear these exchanges going between the tech CEOs and members of Congress? And I'll pass it over to you, Carmen, first.
Sure. I mean, as I'm, listening to this, I think the thing that stood out to me just now is children under 13 want to use Instagram, and so we want to make it a safe space for them, and that is just so concerning, right? I mean, I think there's so much there to unpack. Like, I don't know if I want my kids on Instagram. I actually was just there. I was on Instagram, and my 7-year-old came over, and she was like, "What is this? Is this Facebook?" No, it's Instagram, but it's owned by Facebook. So I went through the whole thing with her, and she said, "This is great." And then she just like started double tapping on like these pictures that I had on there. And my Instagram is mostly puppies. That's all I'm just tracking a bunch of golden retrievers, and that, that's who I follow. But she's like, "This is great. Now we double tap. Can we write a comment about why we like it?" And I honestly wanted to take my phone and throw it across the room and just say no.
It would only taken 5 minutes before she would have gone down the rabbit hole of spreading misinformation. It happened so quick.
Exactly. But I also think about this too, when I was a kid, when I was in school, all the things that happen when you're with your friends, and how you pass notes and do all of that. But there's also the bullying that happens. And, I can just see how these tools, these are tools right now that people are using to organize insurrections, how they can be easily used, to target and bully kids as well. And so I think there's just, we really need to understand, just access to technology as a whole, we need it, but also we need the literacy, and we need the understanding of what it can do and what the limits should be. And I think that's something that, under 13 is, it's really, I think we're lacking in that right now, just really understanding that. And that's where I worry very much that they're even considering this right now.
Yeah. What about for you, Brandi? What stood out so far in this exchange?
Yeah, I mean, you guys really nailed it. I definitely, my mind is buzzing with a lot of the things that came out of that last section, and the ways in which we really need to look at some of the coded language, and some of the ways in which some of the narratives that are put forward by members of Congress and by CEOs are used to obscure real issues and challenges, and used as a cover to erode away at people's basic civil and human rights. And one of those big buzzwords or phrases is this idea of child pornography and sex trafficking. And we have to address this. We have to address these different issues to protect the kids. There's a lot of work that's gone on for years by folks like Jeff Chester at the Center for Digital Democracy, the Berkeley Media Studies Group, to do a lot of work around the Child Online Privacy Protection Act and other pieces of legislation that are really meant to deal with these issues about protecting children from predatory advertising practices and a number of other exploitation issues that can happen online. And I think there's work that can be done to update those types of pieces of legislation. I think to use this as a particular talking point, though, to blow up Section 230, I think there's a couple things here. One, Section 230 has never now, nor will it ever be, any legislation, cover, or protection for illegal acts. So we have to keep doubling down on that again and again. What's illegal is illegal. And there's not really, Section 230 isn't going to change that. But what we do see is them taking the biggest boogeyman possible and using this idea of child pornography, and using that as a way to, like you said, with assess that harming, adult consenting sex workers or harming people online, actually making work conditions dangerous for a number of people by attempting to use this as a fix-all. So I really do think paying attention to how these terms are being used, and all of the different ways in which we see that push and pull between, the tech companies responding. They understand that Congress wants to hear them talk about what they're doing to address child pornography. So there's this dance that we're seeing play out between the CEOs and the Congress people, and them trying to like provide these right answers while avoiding the actual sort of meaningful regulation that I think we do need to get to address the issues that are happening on these platforms.
That's right. And I think one interesting thing I think for us to note is it's that use of child pornography, child sex trafficking is a trope that gets utilized on both sides, both from the side of politicians who are trying to justify the kinds of policy interventions that they're trying to drive, like doing away with Section 230, but also tech companies. You know, I've been in rooms, I think, Brandi, you and I were actually in the same room when we were talking with the policy council at Amazon about their facial recognition software. And they were like, the reason we can't get rid of this tool, like this is such a valuable tool to law enforcement to like track down like, you know, child sex traffickers.
Yeah.
It's like it gets used on both sides at very convenient moments. I want to bring in a couple folks who are going to join us in the digital studio to join us in this watch party. We've got a couple wonderful folks coming in from a great organization that many of us work with, the Action Center on Race and the Economy, ACRE for short. And we've got two incredible folks, including Jessica Quiason, who's the Deputy Research Director, and Tracey Cordair, the Deputy Campaign Director. Just want to see if y'all are on. Can you hear us? Can we hear you?
I hope so. I can hear you.
We can hear you. Welcome to the Big Tech on Blast watch party. It's so wonderful to have you here. In this last exchange, actually, coincidentally, we heard a question from one of the members of Congress, and they started referencing the Christchurch shootings, the Christchurch mosque shootings. Now, you all at ACRE have actually worked on a report called Fanning the Flames that looks at the relationship between the spread of anti-Muslim bigotry on social media platforms and in particular looking at how platforms are actually like profiting off of the spread of this type of content. So whoever wants to kick us off, can you share a little bit more about this report? Because I think it offers such great evidence and context that not only are the platforms aware of the problem of these kinds of societal manifestations of violence that are emanating from their platforms, but they're actively benefiting from it.
Right. Yeah, I'm happy to kick it off. Thanks again for inviting us to this panel. This is really exciting. It's a great event. I've never been a part of something like this before. It was very cool. And happy to be sharing with Tracey and with Carmen and Brandi as well. So thank you. Yeah, so Fanning the Flames is a report that we released following the Christchurch shooting and 2 mosques in New Zealand. And we thought it was really important to kind of underscore the fact that, you know, what made Christchurch possible was a web of ultra powerful corporations that create the conditions to allow for something like that to happen, right? And so social media companies and corporations, especially YouTube, being like kind of the most important actors in this web of corporate power. And knowing how, you know, they know that there's a problem, that there's a lot of anti-Muslim bigotry and what we call anti-Masa, so Muslim, Arab, and South Asian bigotry that's on their platform. But I've heard like Susan talk about these kind of like problematic content, they call it, over the past few years. And she always says like, well, you know, it's actually a very small percentage of what we have on our platforms, which is like technically true if you're just looking at the numbers, but the impact that people like Alex Jones and like other like notorious racists have had by having that platform, even though they're now no longer on the platform, is enormous, right? Like it is totally disproportionate to like the number of videos they have. Like, yeah, sure, maybe he only had like 100 videos of like the million videos on YouTube, but like those have like outsized influence on the kind of culture that it creates around extreme anti-Muslim hate that leads to real world violence offline, right? So the Fanning the Flames report, we relaunched it around the anniversary of the Christchurch shooting this past year, earlier this year. And we just thought it was like, you know, especially important to highlight it again because the New Zealand government themselves came out with a report late last year that actually showed that they could see that YouTube was the thing that radicalized the shooter in that unfortunate massacre. So even like on a state level, like New Zealand is recognizing that YouTube is a problem, and YouTube didn't really have any sort of meaningful response to that. So we really see that like, you know, it's a problem of kind of like YouTube knows that it's a problem, but they're just like making way too much money for this to really be something that they're going to address in real terms, right? So 2020, they made $147 billion with a B. Like that is like more money than like lots of like whole like country governments have, right, in their budgets. Like that's like an insane amount of money. So I've been talking a lot though. I'll kind of like step back now for Tracey. You wanted to add anything? Sorry, Tracey.
No, I was listening to you. I was like, yes, I was like hyping you up in my head. So thank y'all for having us on. You know, one of the things I feel like even the time that I've had at ACRE, I learned so much about this. And so one of the ways our colleague Rama talks about it is that YouTube like feeds people this content. So for example, like I watch General Hospital on YouTube sometimes because I'm like soaps. And then it'll say, what is the next video you want to watch? Right? Like, so they will feed me another General Hospital video in the very same way that if white supremacists are watching like this white supremacist content, then they get fed another video. And so there is such a profit margin there for them. There's no incentive for them to stop doing that. And so when we hear, like Jess said, the government's actually saying your platform harmed us, your platform killed people, they still, the financial incentive to not change it, they have decided to put that profit over people's actual lives.
Thanks, you guys, for both being on. I want to have a little bit of a side note question, because one of the interesting exchanges I think I saw in there was when the CEOs were being asked about their relationships with law enforcement, and Jack Dorsey kept being like, we have a strong relationship with law enforcement. I was like, y'all got
I'm sure they do.
Y'all got a strong relationship. And I know that ACRE has done a lot of work around surveillance technology and big tech and how that's played out. Can you guys say a little more about the work and research you guys are doing on that surveillance and that relationship between law enforcement and the tech companies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have a report coming out at the beginning of April on 21st century policing, really looking at the ways that surveillance capitalism is showing up in our communities. And so we even hear about like the defund fights and the invest divest fights. People create like this idea that it's like a budget line item. So that if we take $20 million away from police, then we can have $20 million for education. And for us, one, we think that you should take all that money from police, and that whatever education needs, 20 million plus, should be, funded however we fund it, progressive revenue, whatever, taxing some of these CEOs. And we also look at it as like a power and control issue. And so what we don't want is to see our communities surveilled. We don't want to see our communities have cops replaced by cameras. And so we are like, we've always seen when they say that we have a strong relationship, I mean, racial capitalism powers the police and it powers them. So of course they have a strong relationship. And so when we see folks like pull videos down from YouTube, from Facebook, when we see people get banned for like speaking out against police violence, like these things feed into each other. So I don't doubt that they have some sort of strong relationship with policing, because the same funding source, the same kind of system of oppression, like powers both of them.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm curious if going back to the Fanning the Flames report, what are some of the top line recommendations that y'all are pushing out there in regards to what the platforms need to do differently to root out anti-Muslim bigotry, to prevent the next Christchurch? Because clearly, they're in this hearing today posturing like some of the many things, all the wonderful things that they are doing to try to prevent things like January 6th, the Christchurch shooting, and all the other things that we've seen that have direct ties to the platforms. In the report, what are you all seeing as like steps that these platforms should be taking, solutions that we should be embracing that maybe take us away from where the conversation has currently been?
Yeah, appreciate that question, Stephen. So with our project that the Fanning the Flames report comes out of, our Crescendo project, which is the project that we have that's fighting anti-Muslim bigotry that we see, especially online, is we're really hoping that, we're really demanding that YouTube, first of all, just be a lot more transparent with the way that their algorithms work and the way that their content moderation policies actually play out in practice, right? And I think that a missing piece that we're seeing and it is just like, yeah, right, how not transparent they are about those things, and also like who they consult, like when they create those algorithms, and to what extent they're actually like incorporating feedback from others, like into how they make their algorithms better to really root out, the content that's so harmful to people. And so specifically what we have as recommendations and how we talk about YouTube is that they involve like Muslim and, as we said, like Masa, like identifying organizations into those conversations that they have to establish like very transparent content moderation policies. But we feel that it's important that people who are most affected by the most harmful content on YouTube have a seat at the table and actually have say with how that content gets moderated, right? So that's kind of the big thing that that we advocate for. So.
And then on the back end of that, we also want to see like repair done for the harm. Like there needs to be amends for these past actions that we know they have done. And so in addition to like the kind of proactive steps, like there needs to be some reparation.
That's right. 100% feel that. Speaking of reparations, want to shout out a wonderful research essay that Free Press, a lot of Carmen's colleagues at Free Press produced called Media 2070. Go check it out. It kind of details the history of anti-Black harm by media institutions. And certainly I think a lot of those harms are replicable here in the context of tech platforms. So definitely encourage folks to check that out. It also makes the case for media reparations, which is, I think, a helpful place to look at for ideas of what we should be thinking about also on the platform side. We're going to jump back into the hearing for a few minutes just for our audience to know, if you're just tuning in, you're here with us in the Big Tech on Blast watch party. We're going to jump back into the hearing, listen to a little bit more of the political theater. And just so folks know, we're going to be going with this live stream until 2 o'clock Eastern. So we've got less than half an hour to go, but we'll come back with a little more analysis, and hopefully Tracey and Jessica, if y'all are still around, would love to continue the conversation with you all, but totally understand if you all need to drop off. So let's jump back into the hearing for a few minutes.
The president, former President Trump, vetoed a pretty big bill, the defense bill, earlier last year over this very issue because he wanted the total repeal, and he didn't get it. But I know that the Senate now has got some legislation that's pending that's looking at a couple reforms, and my sense is that we may see something here in the near future as well. I serve as one of only 2 House members on the Commission on Combating Synthetic Opioid Trafficking. It's a multi-federal agency. It's co-chaired by David Trone in the House and Tom Cotton in the Senate. And there is a lot of concern that we all have, not only as parents, but as community leaders across the country on opioids and the inability to remove illegal offers of opioids, steroids, even fake COVID-19 vaccines. Very troubling, I think, as we see some of these platforms push such content to a user in real search of it. So I guess my first question is to you, Mr. Zuckerberg. The sale of illegal drugs on your platform does violate your policy, yet it does remain a problem on your platforms. Can you explain the resources that you currently have devoted to addressing the issue and whether or not you plan to devote more? And this is an issue that I intend to raise with the commission as we look forward to this in the next number of months.
Thanks, Congressman. I think this is an important area and a good question. We have more than 1,000 engineers who work on our what we call integrity systems, that basically are AI systems that try to help find content that violates our policies. You're right that content does violate our policies. And we also have more than 35,000 people who work in content review who basically are either responding to flags that they get from the community or checking things that our AI systems flag for them but aren't sure about. And this is an area, when we're talking about reforming Section 230, where I think it would be reasonable to expect that large platforms especially build effective systems to be able to combat and fight this kind of clearly illegal content. I think that there will be a lot of ongoing debate about how to handle content which people find distasteful or maybe harmful but is legal. But in this case, when the content is illegal, I think it is pretty reasonable to expect that large platforms build effective systems for moderating this.
So we saw earlier this week, of course, we don't know all the facts on this terrible shooting in Boulder, Colorado. It appears, at least some of the initial reports, that the alleged shooter was in fact bullied. And I think I saw some press reports that some of it had happened online as well. What process do you have that it would allow parents or families to be able to pursue anti-bullying efforts that might be on your platforms?
Thanks, Congressman. I think bullying is a really important case to consider for Section 230 because, first of all, it's horrible and we need to fight it, and we have policies that are against it. But it also is often the case that that bullying content is not clearly illegal. So when we talk about needing the ability under something like Section 230 to be able to moderate content, which is not only clearly illegal content but broader, one of the primary examples that we have in mind is making sure that we can stop people from bullying children. And here we work with a number of advocacy groups. We work with law enforcement to help fight this. This is a huge effort and part of what we do, and I think it's extremely important.
And other than taking the approach that you don't want to see any changes to 230, what suggestions might you have for us as we examine this issue?
Sorry, Congressman, I'm not saying that I don't think that there should be changes. I'm saying that I think 230 still broadly is important, so I wouldn't repeal the whole thing. But the three changes that I've basically suggested are, one is around transparency, that large platforms should have to report on a regular cadence for each category of harmful content, how much of that harmful content they're finding, and how effective their systems are at dealing with it. The second thing I think that we should do is hold large platforms to a standard where they should have effective systems for handling clearly illegal content like opioids or child exploitation or things like that. And the third thing that I think is an important principle is that these policies really do need to apply more to large platforms. And I think we need to find a way to exempt small platforms so that way, when I was getting started with Facebook, if we'd gotten hit with a lot of lawsuits around content, it might have been prohibitive for me to get started. And I think none of us here want to see the next set of platforms from being stopped from kind of being able to get started and grow.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Ms. Eshu.
Am I unmuted? Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. Well, it's still, we're Californian, so it's good morning for us. I want to start by saying that content moderation, like removing posts or banning accounts, is about treating symptoms. And I think that we need to treat symptoms, but I also think that we need to address two underlying diseases. The first is that your products amplify extremism. The second is that your business models of targeted ads enable misinformation to thrive because you chase user engagement at great costs to our society. So to Mr. Pichai, last month the Anti-Defamation League found that YouTube amplifies extremism. Scores of journalists and researchers agree. And here's what they say happens. A user watching an extremist video is often recommended more such videos, slowly radicalizing the user. YouTube is not doing enough to address recommendations, and it's why Representative Melankowski and myself introduced the Protecting Americans from Dangerous Algorithms Act to narrowly amend Section 230 so courts can examine the role of algorithmic amplification that leads to violence. And it's also why I, along with 40 of my House colleagues, wrote to each of you about this issue. And Mr. Chairman, I ask that those letters be placed into the record. So my question to you, Mr. Pichai, is, are you willing to overhaul YouTube's core recommendation engine to correct this issue? Yes or no?
Congresswoman, we have overhauled our recommendation systems, and I know you've engaged on these issues before, pretty substantially in pretty much any area.
But Mr. Pichai, yes or no? Because we still have a huge problem. And I outlined what are you saying that the Anti-Defamation League doesn't know what they're talking about? All these journalists and researchers, there is a lot more to address. And that's why I'm asking you if you're willing to overhaul YouTube's core recommendation engine to correct this. It's serious, it's dangerous. What more can I say about it? Yes or no?
Congresswoman, if I may explain, we have
I don't have time to explain. So, let me just say this to witnesses. We don't do filibuster in the House. That's something that's done in the Senate. So filibuster doesn't work with us. To Mr. Zuckerberg, your algorithms use unseemly amounts of data to keep users on your platform because that leads to more ad revenue. Now, businesses are in business to make money. We all understand that. But your model has a cost to society. The most engaging posts are often those that induce fear, anxiety, anger, and that includes deadly misinformation. The Center for Countering Digital Hate found that the Explore and suggested parts of Instagram are littered with COVID misinformation, election disinformation, and QAnon posts. So this is dangerous, and it's why Representative Schakowsky and I are doing a bill that is going to ban this business model of surveillance advertising. So are you willing to redesign your products to eliminate your focus on addicting users to your platforms at all costs? Yes or no?
Congresswoman, as I said before, the teams that design our algorithms
let me just say this, and I think it's irritating all of us, and that is that no one seems to know the word yes or the word no. Which one is it? If you don't want to answer, just say I don't want to answer. So yes or no?
Congresswoman, these are nuanced issues.
Okay, so I'm going to say that's a no. To Mr. Dorsey, as the chairwoman of the Health Subcommittee, I think that you need to eliminate all COVID misinformation and not label or reduce its spread, but remove it. I looked at a tweet this morning. Robert Kennedy Jr. Links the death of baseball legend Hank Aaron to the COVID vaccine, even though fact checkers debunked the story. The tweet has 9,000 retweets. Will you take this down? And why haven't you? And also, why haven't you banned the 12 accounts that are spewing its deadly COVID misinformation? This could cost lives.
No, we won't take it down because it didn't violate our policy. So we have a clear policy in place.
What kind of policy is that? Is it a policy for misinformation?
No.
Gentle lady's time has expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Scalise.
All right, this is a good time to jump on in because Steve Scalise is about
Mr. Scalise here?
Thank you. Say some mess. We don't want to hear it. let's jump in. I mean, what a riveting!
So spicy.
Yeah, it was wild.
Oh
that
yeah,
was great.
She filibustered all of them. Just so much going on in here. So much that got mentioned. So very efficient use of Ann Eshu's 5 minutes. Representative Ann Eshu's 5 minutes. She touched on Robert F. Kennedy, who is actually, if folks didn't know this, a huge perpetuator of COVID misinformation and has been for this, over this past year. And you can see the kind of growth and visibility in his presence on social media platforms growing as the more that he stepped into spreading misinformation around COVID. We heard about 230 again, and Facebook got grilled on their principles for regulation. It's worth noting everything that Zuckerberg mentioned are things, like we should be, earning our immunity. Essentially, we should have proven systems for handling clearly illegal content. These are all things Facebook already has in place, and still the problems persist. So it's very disingenuous to say like these are principles for how to regulate us when it's already the environment that you navigate. We heard about YouTube, and Anishu went pretty deep on YouTube about trying to overhaul their recommendation systems, which leads to some of the stuff that you were talking about, Tracey, about like going down the rabbit hole. And going down the rabbit hole of General Hospital is one thing. Going down the rabbit hole of white supremacy is a whole nother that has big consequences. So
Very different.
Justin, Tracey, you are on with us for a few minutes. I wanted to toss it to you all, like your reflections coming out of this segment.
One of the things that really sticks to me is like how they act like it's so difficult to ban people from these sites. They're really not. I caught a 14-day ban in 2018 for saying men are trash on Facebook. I don't even know who reported me. So I'm trying to understand how that's a bannable offense when sending out deadly misinformation on COVID is not. So I just think that they need to figure out a better line than saying that they can't ban people, because that's not true.
Right. Yeah, I have to agree with that too. I think there are lots of accounts out there of like activists as well who are like on, YouTube talking about their experience as like trans people, or like, different Palestinian activists talking about issues that they're seeing in their community, and with like, kind of, the way that how war is like ripping apart their communities, and like those videos get taken down, right? So what Tracey is saying is like, how do these algorithms like actually work if like people who are out here talking about really important things that create kind of the value of YouTube as well is supposed to be kind of a platform where folks can express themselves. You hear and see things that you wouldn't see anywhere else. These things are being taken down because they violate community guidelines. And then these people get very little information as to why it gets taken down. And then it just gets put back up just kind of magically, like, oh, we made a mistake, sorry. But it's like, these things are really important. And I think, I've read different accounts of folks who've had these types of censorship happen to them. And they're like, this makes me feel like YouTube actually doesn't value me, and doesn't actually appreciate like what I bring to the platform. And it makes me feel like, I can't actually express myself. So these are also like really important issues that we need to deal with. And the fact that like a lot of people of color are dealing with this, and kind of what that means too. So.
Yeah, and that's so important what you're saying, here about we don't know what they're doing with their content moderation policies. We one of the things we've been asking for is like these training materials. Like, how are you actually training your content moderators? Because Facebook said, hey, look, in 2018, we're going to show you our community guidelines. This is what we actually give our content moderators when reviewing things. And then you come to find out they actually have something else that's internal, that's implementation standards. They have something else called known questions. And then, Tracey, to your point about getting banned, we found, I forget exactly, there was like a report that came, like some journalists found the training materials and saw that white men are a protected class, but not Black children, right? So that's how they're training their moderators. And so when things get flagged, of course, they're just going to take down that content. And I don't think they've actually, had the, it seems like they say you can't use the reporting tools to harass people. But how do they actually study that? And do they understand when they're getting, certain people are getting flagged, that they're actually being harassed through their own tools that they're using? So there's a lot there. And I think, in terms of like these global standards, right? Like the community guidelines are the speech of the world. Like, is that really fair? I mean, we're talking about what content is illegal here, what content is illegal there. And there's some other parts of the world that actually have, rules about what can and cannot be said, right? And I feel like when we start to put everyone in our, United States First Amendment frame, it really does actually harm a lot of communities.
And I think it's like perfectly believable that Mark Zuckerberg thinks that white men are a protected class of people.
That's right. That part right there. Tracey, Jessica, thank you so much for joining us here on this live stream, the Big Tech on Blast watch party. Where can folks get in touch with you all, follow some of ACRE's incredible reporting, where should folks check y'all out?
Yeah, acrecampaigns.org, at ACRE Campaigns on Twitter. We're also on Instagram, so please, like, follow, subscribe, whatever.
Totally. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. We're going to start pivoting into the closing of our watch party. As we see here, GK Butterfield getting ready to do a little exchange. We're not going to be able to dive back into the hearing. I think it's just going to be the three of us here, Brandi, Carmen, talking through what we've learned so far, because we know that these congressional hearings can go on for hella long, and we ain't got hella long hours to be doing this today. Now, if someone wanted to pay us to be on and do these watch parties more often, I am happy to do it. But as we start to kind of land this thing, first of all, just want to give lots of love and shout outs to the folks that have been watching us. See a lot of familiar faces in the comments. See a lot of wonderful, fun chatter. I hope folks have had a great time. Also want to give a shout out to the fact that we've been doing the Big Tech on Blast bingo. Let us know if you hit bingo. I got a humble beginning story from Mark Zuckerberg on this last one. So if folks were waiting on that one, we got it in this last segment. Let's go ahead and just decompress a little bit with what we've heard. I think it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about YouTube, partially because in the times that we cut away, we actually cut away quite a bit from Sundar Pichai. And metaphorically, in some ways, like YouTube and Google fly under the surface when it comes to criticism of platforms when these kinds of terrible moments like the events of January 6th happen. I know Free Press, Carmen, has been launching a campaign to go after YouTube. So I'm curious if we can all just kind of talk a little bit about what do we see as some of the major flaws around YouTube, and what are some of the things that we would like to see changed?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I do feel like they've flown under the radar. And, part of this is like, how are their policies being enforced? How do you go down that rabbit hole, right? People know that this happens. But part of our campaign too here is to just ban Trump, right? I feel like there's this, like, he's like in a purgatory right now with YouTube. And, we saw Susan Wojcicki do an interview saying, well, we'll let him back on the platform when the risk of violence is reduced. What does that mean? And, luckily the interviewer asked, like, well, how do you do that? And she said, oh, we talk to law enforcement. We look at all these different reports. I mean, I think this is something, we were talking about in the last segment about their relationship that they have with law enforcement, and they're not really transparent about it, right? They don't really tell their users, like, hey, we're kind of looking at police reports. We're talking to law enforcement to decide whether you deserve a spot on our platform. But here you have her saying this about Trump, and they cite their 3 strikes policy, and I think we have to unpack, like, what does that really mean? Like, is it really just 1 strike to incite an insurrection? And I feel like for many of us, if we had done anything remotely similar, like, we'd just be off the platform. It wouldn't be a consideration. So I think there's, it goes also back to Heidi Beirich's report talking about how, these rules need to apply equally to everyone, and especially to world leaders.
Where do you see YouTube fitting in the kind of magnitude of the problem, Brandi? Because I feel like you spend some time sleuthing on these dark webs, and you probably have a whole nother like data set avatar that, if we were to manifest it visually, looks something like the Joker, that navigates the interwebs, like looking through the dark stuff that most of us are fortunate not to have to deal with day to day. But in your research, where do you see YouTube fitting into this larger problem of disinformation, misinformation?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of pieces that I definitely want to make sure we unpack in these closing minutes. But I want to just pause and take a moment to just really reflect on how amazing the Congresswoman was. Like, she went in. Like, she actually, I was like, and she's been a long time advocate on a lot of the issues that we've dealt with over the years, and net neutrality, broadband access, privacy. And so, like, California has led the way on privacy legislation as well. And so I really appreciate some of the use that the Congresswoman made of her 5 minutes, because it was ripe with a lot of different issues that I really want to bring out. So one, I think you guys mentioned that YouTube has tended to fly under the radar, YouTube, Google. There's a reason for that. I think when you see these different CEOs and you compare and contrast their different styles against each other, you really see a comparison of like new school tech companies versus old school tech companies and some of the lessons and the approach that they take away. So I would say in Twitter and Facebook, they're very new school. It's part of that like sort of celebrity CEO thing. They're very brash, they're very public. And they're like in your face, which I think, can open them up to critiques in a specific way. Whereas you see Google, and I would put Amazon in this category too. We know Jeff Bezos now, but for like a long time, Jeff Bezos as a CEO really flew under the radar. We see the same thing with CEO Pichai. They're much more of the sort of Comcast school of CEO, where even if you hate the company, you could not necessarily know the name of the CEO. In the same way, they've also like developed a relationship with a lot of the right people, a lot of the different, people that have worked at civil rights organizations. They have really been different in their approach to civil rights groups in a way that I think we've seen play out in which companies are more publicly critiqued and which ones aren't. And I think we'll continue to see that in a way that we really need to watch out for, because Google, YouTube is actually, by my estimation, one of the worst offender of a lot of the things that we're seeing right now, whether it's the surveillance economy and the way our information is being bought, sold, and processed at scale, whether it's YouTube, which is a cesspool for conspiracism and a very hard place to research. Like, one of the reasons why we don't tend to get as many reports around some of the content on YouTube is because it's that much harder and less transparent and able to crack in the same way as Facebook or other spaces. But it has very much pushed a lot of disinformation in a lot of different spaces. Particularly in the early days of COVID, a lot of like Black disinformation was circulating via YouTube videos and content in a way that wasn't taken down. But I think the broad takeaway, I wouldn't be doing my due diligence if I didn't name this, is that what we have seen time and time again, what we saw in the CEO antitrust hearings at the end of last summer, and what we're seeing now, is that these companies are too big to regulate at scale. They're too big to regulate themselves, and they're too big to be regulated by government. They are essentially in a lot of ways operating as their own private government. And we've seen this play out in places like Australia, where attempts to regulate has been met with Google and Facebook saying, well, fine, we'll pull out. And then there's the risk of them destabilizing the whole economy as a direct result of that. No one or two companies should be able to completely destabilize an economy or political system. Yet that's what we're dealing with these companies. And we heard Mark Zuckerberg say, oh, we should think about regulation for big companies, but maybe think different from smaller companies. So it's like he's sort of demonstrating this throwing a bone or awareness of, that these companies are too big and have to be willing to show some openness to being regulated. But we've seen time and time again that they are in fact extremely resistant to any meaningful regulation. And because of the ways they operate as, monopolies, oligarchies, whatever you want to call them, those small companies can barely even get off the ground because a lot of them are getting swallowed up by these big companies. So I would say, as we close down this conversation and we look at what came out of this hearing, I would really urge Congress and all of us to really loop the different hearings that we've heard together. Like, look at the stuff that came out of the antitrust hearing. Look at the stuff that's come out of this like disinformation, misinformation hearing. What we're seeing is like a broad has to be dealt with through a number of multi-pronged approaches. And there is not one size fits all solution to that, but we have to think about these companies as a much deeper threat than these kind of like smaller rabbit holes that we're often dealing with, or these silos in which we're talking about the harms of these companies.
Damn, I could not have put it any better myself in terms of summarizing what we just watched and what moves, what comes forward. I think that one thing I think that we should lift up as we close out, that's just a warning label on everything, is, there's a new report that just came out from Public Citizen, and it documents where it tracks the spending of a lot of major industries who are lobbying members of Congress, for the types of regulations that they want. And I think most of us, if we thought about, what's the industry that spends the most amount of money to get what they want, people would be thinking about some of the large industries that we know about, like big tobacco, big bank, Wall Street. And in fact, in this last year, during the 2020 election cycle, big tech surpassed, big money, big oil, big tobacco. And guess what? They're the big in the whole lobbying scheme today. So a lot of what we're hearing today, the concessions, the invitations for regulations publicly, that's not necessarily going to be matched up with what they deploy their lobbying armies to say and advocate for on the Hill, in our state legislatures, and in other parts of the world and other kind of governing bodies. So before we close out, want to toss it, Carmen, to shout out a campaign relatedly that y'all are focused on called Ya Basta Facebook. And we've talked a little bit about the spread of Spanish disinformation, but put your plug in there for this campaign and who y'all are working with before we transition out.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So Free Press has been working with the Center for American Progress and the National Hispanic Media Coalition on this issue of Spanish language disinformation. And so last week, we actually we had an event with Representative Cardenas with the Real Facebook Oversight Board, trying to highlight this issue. And here today, we're talking about how Facebook is failing with content moderation in English. Now, if you think that they're failing in English, just wait till you see what's happening in Spanish. Eric much earlier noted is that it's all across these languages. With Spanish in particular, the reason that we had, we honed in on Spanish is that there are 40 million people who speak Spanish at home here in the United States. So the fact that Facebook can't figure out how to, at the very least, equally apply its rules to English and Spanish here in the US is very problematic. It's this disparate treatment. It's, at first it felt like it was an oversight, but we had so many conversations with them, and it really now it's just negligence. Like they are really not addressing this issue. So last week we launched this campaign, Ya Basta Facebook, Enough is Enough. And we gave them an action plan. Like, if you want to get rid of Spanish language disinformation, or at least, start trying to curb the spread of it, here are some steps that you need to take. And one of them is that they need to actually get an executive in there, someone that's overseeing this, someone that is actually saying, how are we doing on Spanish language content moderation? What does that mean? And someone that's here in the US, not someone that's somewhere across the globe. I think that's really important. And the other, parts of this action plan are, I mentioned the training materials. We'd like to see what these training materials look like for Spanish content moderators. And then we wanted to interrogate, like, what is the translation algorithm doing? What does this mean when you get English, or Spanish content and you're translating it into English, and you're actually like missing the point in the translation, to the point where something like a call to arms that's very clear in Spanish seems like nonsense if you're looking at the English translation? Those are the types of questions that we're having. And, do these content moderators review the English translation, or are they reviewing the content in the original Spanish? Because, and I've been thinking about this, how Sophia Noble talked about algorithms of oppression when it came to Google's recommendation algorithms. Now I'm seeing the same thing happening with the translation algorithms, right? And so it's just, we have all these questions, and I think this they need to answer this. We had, again, many meetings with them leading up to this, and, ya basta, Facebook, enough is enough. We need answers. We need them to adhere to this action plan.
And ya basta, big tech companies in general. So thank you so much, Carmen, for being on here. You can follow Carmen on Twitter at Carmen Seurato. Check out Free Press at Free Press. Brandi Collins Dexter, you can find her on the Twitters at Branding Brandi with an I. And anywhere else that folks should check you out, Brandi?
Yes, I'm currently a visiting fellow at the Shorenstein Center, and we have released a couple of really interesting reports for folks to check out about misinformation and disinformation online and things like keyword squatting. So be sure to stop by Shorenstein to learn more.
And shout outs to all the folks that watched online. And thank you for tuning in. Shout outs to Team Media Justice for putting on this wonderful live stream. You can catch us at Media Justice. You can also check out our website, mediajustice.org. You can catch me at Stephen Renderos on Twitter and anywhere that books are sold. No, I'm joking. I'm not an author. Not like these other folks. Thank you all so much for joining us here. And I'm going to bring in a little trap music to close this out. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Peace.